In the shadows of American history, there are names that never made it into the history books. Serial killers whose crimes were so brutal, so methodical, that even today, decades after their capture or death, their stories remain largely untold. These aren't the household names like Bundy or Dahmer. These are the forgotten monsters who slipped through the cracks of time, leaving behind trails of blood and terror that most people have never heard of. Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of criminal history to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. From America's first documented serial killer who terrorized the frontier wilderness, to a blood-soaked countess whose name became synonymous with vampiric horror. From a highway predator who stalked young men across the Midwest, to a phantom who haunted the nation's capital, targeting innocent children. These are stories that will chill you to the bone and remind you that evil has always walked among us. What makes these killers particularly terrifying isn't just their body counts or their methods of murder. It's how they operated in plain sight, how they evaded capture for years, and how their crimes revealed the darkest aspects of human nature. Some were driven by twisted ideologies, others by pure sadistic pleasure, but all of them shared one common trait. They were monsters hiding behind human faces. Let me start with a story that takes us back to the very birth of America itself, to a time when the frontier was wild and lawless, and when one man's descent from war hero to serial killer would earn him the title of America's first documented serial murderer. Samuel Mason was born around 1760 in what is now Charlestown, West Virginia. But this wasn't just any ordinary child growing up on the American frontier. Mason was destined to become a figure of both honor and infamy, a man whose life would span the entire spectrum from celebrated war hero to cold-blooded killer. During the American Revolution, Mason served as a captain in the Ohio County Militia, fighting for the very freedom that would later allow him to terrorize innocent travelers. According to Ohio County court records from January 7, 1797, Mason was personally recommended to Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, to serve as captain of the militia. This was a man who commanded respect, who fought for liberty, who was trusted with the lives of his fellow soldiers. But something changed in Samuel Mason after the war ended. Maybe it was the violence he'd witnessed. Maybe it was the lawlessness of frontier life. Or maybe there was always something dark lurking beneath the surface of this war hero. Whatever the cause, Mason would transform from a defender of American freedom into one of its greatest threats. After the Revolution, Mason moved his family to the territory of Spanish Louisiana, in what is now Missouri. On the surface, he appeared to be just another veteran trying to make a new life for himself and his family in the wilderness. But Mason had other plans. He began operating as a highwayman along the Natchez Trace in the Mississippi Territory in present-day Mississippi. The Natchez Trace was a dangerous 440-mile path that connected Nashville, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi. It was the primary route for travelers, merchants, and settlers moving through the region. And it was along this isolated wilderness road that Samuel Mason would earn his most chilling nickname. After each robbery and murder, Mason would leave a calling card that struck terror into the hearts of anyone who discovered it. It was a signature of death, a promise that the man responsible was still out there, still hunting. But Mason wasn't working alone. He had formed associations with other killers who would later become infamous in their own right. Among his criminal network were Makaja and Wiley Harp, known as the Harp Brothers, who are considered among America's first serial killers. He also worked with Peter Alston and possibly John Duff, a notorious counterfeiter. This wasn't just one man gone bad. This was an entire criminal ecosystem operating in the American wilderness. Mason and his gang made their headquarters at Cave in Rock, a notorious hideout for river pirates along the Ohio River. This natural cave formation provided the perfect base of operations for their criminal activities. From here, they could prey on flatboats and travelers moving along the river, robbing, murdering, and disposing of bodies with terrifying efficiency. The cave became so associated with criminal activity that eventually a group of regulators called the Exterminators, under the leadership of Captain Young of Mercer County, Kentucky, forced Mason and his gang to abandon their stronghold in the summer of 1799. But this setback only pushed Mason to become more desperate and more dangerous. When Spanish authorities finally captured Mason, they discovered evidence that would haunt investigators for generations. Hidden in his baggage were 20 human scalps and $7,000 in currency. 20 human scalps. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't just robbery or even simple murder. This was systematic butchery on a scale that defied comprehension. The Spanish colonial governor ordered Mason and his associates to be handed over to American authorities in the Mississippi Territory. But even while being transported up the Mississippi River under armed guard, Mason refused to give up. In a desperate escape attempt, he and his gang members overpowered their guards. During the chaos, Mason was shot in the head, but even wounded, he managed to escape. This is where the story takes an even darker turn. Despite being a wanted man with a bullet wound in his head, Mason continued his killing spree. C. Claiborne had seen enough. He offered a reward of $2,000 for Mason's capture or his severed head. $2,000 was an enormous sum of money at the time, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. The promise of such a large reward would ultimately lead to Mason's downfall, but in the most twisted way possible. Two of his former criminal associates, Wiley Harp and Peter Alston, decided they wanted that reward money. They tracked down Mason and killed him, then severed his head to collect the bounty. But when they arrived to claim their reward, authorities recognized them as wanted criminals themselves. Wiley Harp was actually one of the infamous Harp brothers, and Peter Alston was a known criminal in his own right. Instead of collecting the reward, both men were identified, captured, and hanged. Samuel Mason's reign of terror was finally over, but his legacy lived on. He had operated for years as America's first documented serial killer, leaving a trail of bodies across the frontier. His methods were brutal, his crimes systematic, and his impact on early American criminal history cannot be overstated. What makes Mason's story particularly chilling is how it illustrates the thin line between civilization and savagery in early America. Here was a man who had fought for American independence, who had been trusted with military command, who appeared to be a respectable family man. Yet beneath that facade lurked a monster who collected human scalps and signed his murders in blood. The frontier provided the perfect hunting ground for someone like Mason. Law enforcement was virtually non-existent, communication was slow, and people frequently disappeared without anyone knowing what had happened to them. Mason exploited these conditions to become one of the most prolific killers in American history. But Samuel Mason was just the beginning. As America grew and changed, so did its monsters. The frontier may have been tamed, but new hunting grounds emerged. Interstate highways crisscrossed the nation, creating opportunities for a new breed of killer to emerge. Men who could hunt across state lines, who could disappear into the anonymity of modern life, who could kill with industrial efficiency. One such killer would terrorize the American Midwest in the 1980s, using the very highways that connected our communities as his personal hunting ground. His name was Larry Eyler, and his story reveals how evil evolved along with American society, becoming more mobile, more efficient, and somehow even more terrifying than what had come before. Larry William Eyler was born on December 21st, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Unlike Samuel Mason, who had started life with promise and respect, Eyler's childhood was marked by instability and abuse from the very beginning. He was the youngest of 4 children, and his parents divorced when he was still very young. This divorce set the pattern for Eyler's entire childhood. His mother remarried multiple times, giving Larry a succession of stepfathers who, according to his own accounts, teased and abused him relentlessly. It was a childhood that would leave deep psychological scars, creating the perfect conditions for something monstrous to take root and grow. In his senior year of high school, Eyler dropped out, unable to cope with the pressures of education while dealing with his turbulent home life. He would later earn his GED, but by then the damage had been done. He was already struggling with his sexual identity in an era when being gay was not just socially unacceptable, but could be genuinely dangerous. This internal conflict would become a driving force in Eyler's psychological development. He hated himself for being gay, and that self-hatred would eventually transform into hatred for others like him. It's a tragic irony that many of his victims would be young gay men, as if by killing them, he could somehow kill the part of himself that he despised. Between 1982 and 1984, Larry Eyler embarked on one of the most systematic and brutal killing sprees in American history. But those numbers may only represent a fraction of his true victim count. Eyler's method was as calculated as it was horrifying. He would cruise the highways in his Ford pickup truck, targeting young male prostitutes, gay men, and hitchhikers. His victims were chosen seemingly at random, united only by their vulnerability and their presence on the roads that Eyler prowled like a predator. Once he had selected a victim, Eyler would offer them a ride, often plying them with alcohol and sedatives such as ethchlorvinol. Once his victims were incapacitated, the real horror would begin. All of Eyler's murders involved restraining his victims, and several were subjected to varying degrees of sadomasochism before being killed. The actual murders were carried out with brutal efficiency. Eyler would stab and slash his victims to death, with the majority of wounds being inflicted to the chest and abdomen. But death was not the end of his victims' suffering. Several were disemboweled after death, and Eyler is known to have dismembered the bodies of 4 of his victims. The disposal of the bodies revealed the calculated nature of Eyler's crimes. His victims were typically discarded in fields close to major interstate highways, their trousers and underwear frequently discovered around their knees or ankles, their shirts and wallets missing from the crime scene. It was a signature that would eventually help law enforcement connect the murders, but not before many more lives were lost. What makes Eiler's crimes particularly disturbing is the psychological component that went beyond the immediate act of murder. He would take photographs of his victims as a way to recall the murders later. This photographic documentation reveals a disturbing need to relive his crimes, indicating a level of premeditation and sadistic pleasure that went far beyond the moment of killing. For years, Eiler managed to evade capture by constantly moving across state lines. The interstate highway system that had been built to connect American communities became his hunting ground, allowing him to kill in one state and dispose of bodies in another, making it incredibly difficult for law enforcement agencies to coordinate their investigations. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. On June 6th, a former lover of Eiler's named Thomas Henderson called the investigation team's confidential hotline. Henderson explained that his former lover had been charged with some sort of stabbing of a young hitchhiker in 1978, possessed a violent temper, and had a disturbing interest in bondage. When investigators conducted a background check on Eiler, they discovered that he had indeed been arrested in 1978 for attempting to sexually assault a teenage hitchhiker whom he had stabbed and left for dead. The handcuffing of the youth's wrists and binding of his ankles matched exactly the modus operandi of the highway murderer. Furthermore, Eiler was known to regularly travel between Indianapolis and Chicago, putting him in the right locations at the right times for many of the murders. Even with this information, investigators were cautious. They began keeping an informal track of Eiler's whereabouts, but didn't place him under full surveillance. It was a decision that would cost more lives, as Eiler continued killing even as law enforcement closed in on him. Eiler's final arrest came in 1984, but by then the damage was done. During his interrogation and trial, the full scope of his crimes became apparent. He had operated for years as a mobile predator, using America's highway system to hunt vulnerable young men across multiple states. The psychological profile that emerged during his trial painted a picture of a man driven by self-hatred and a twisted need for control. His crimes weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned attacks designed to give him power over life and death. Each murder was both an act of hatred against his victims and an act of self-destruction, as if by killing others like himself, he could somehow escape his own inner demons. Larry Eiler died of AIDS on March 6, 1994, while serving his sentence at the Illinois State Penitentiary. 4 days after his death, his lawyer, Kathleen Zellner, held a news conference where she revealed the names of additional men Eiler had confessed to killing. Among these were Ralph Calise, Gustavo Herrera, and Irvin Gibson, a 16-year-old who had been found dead in the woods of Lake County, Illinois, 11 years earlier. The posthumous confession provided some closure to families who had waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. C, in the early 1970s, where a predator stalked the nation's capital. C, their bodies were later discovered along Interstate 295, the Anacostia Freeway. The case became known as the Freeway Phantom Murders, and to this day, the killer's identity remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. The first victim was 13-year-old Carol Denise Spinks. On the evening of April 25th, 1901, Carol's older sister sent her to buy groceries at a 7-Eleven just half a mile from their home. It was a routine errand, the kind of trip she'd made countless times before. Carol walked out of the store carrying her bag of groceries, and then she simply vanished. For 6 agonizing days, her family searched the streets, called hospitals, and prayed for her safe return. Then came the phone call no parent should ever receive. Carol's body was found behind St. Elizabeth's Hospital on a grassy embankment next to the northbound lanes of Interstate 295. The scene was devastating. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, but what made investigators' blood run cold was the evidence that she had been kept alive for several days before her murder. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. Someone had abducted this 13-year-old girl, held her captive, and tortured her before finally ending her life. The investigation that followed was plagued with problems from the very beginning. This was 1971, and the resources available to law enforcement were limited compared to today's standards. DNA testing didn't exist. Forensic science was in its infancy. But perhaps most damaging of all was the attitude of the police department itself. These were young black girls from poor neighborhoods, and in the racially charged atmosphere of early 1970s America, their cases didn't receive the attention they deserved. 7 months passed before the killer struck again. On November 15th, 1971, 18-year-old Brenda Faye Woodard was returning home from having dinner with a high school classmate. She boarded a city bus around 11:30 p.m., planning to make the short trip back to her Maryland Avenue home. She never made it. Approximately 6 hours later, a police officer discovered her body in a grassy area near Prince George's County Hospital. Like Carol Spinks, Brenda had been sexually assaulted and strangled, but this time, the killer left something behind that would haunt investigators for decades. In one of Brenda's coat pockets, police found a handwritten note. The message was chilling in its casual cruelty. "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women." The note was written on paper, torn from Brenda's own school notebook, and handwriting analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The killer had dictated the note to Brenda, forcing her to write her own death message before he murdered her. The psychological implications were staggering. This wasn't just a killer who took lives. This was someone who derived pleasure from psychological torture. He had forced an 18-year-old girl to participate in her own murder by writing out his confession. The level of control and sadistic manipulation required for such an act revealed a mind that was both organized and deeply disturbed. 3 more victims would follow in rapid succession. Nenomoshia Yates, 12 years old, vanished while walking to a grocery store and was found strangled near the Anacostia River. Brenda Crockett, also 10, disappeared while running an errand for her family and was discovered along Interstate 295. Diane Williams, 17, was abducted while boarding a bus and found dead near Route 202. Each victim followed the same horrifying pattern: abduction, sexual assault, strangulation, and disposal along major roadways. The freeway phantom seemed to be taunting law enforcement with his choice of dump sites, a major thoroughfare used by thousands of commuters daily. By leaving the bodies in such visible locations, the killer was making a statement. He wasn't trying to hide his crimes. He was displaying them like grotesque trophies. What made the case even more terrifying was the killer's apparent ability to blend into the community. These girls weren't snatched from isolated areas, by a stranger in a van. They were taken from busy streets, bus stops, and neighborhood stores in broad daylight or early evening hours. This suggested someone who looked harmless, someone who could approach young girls without raising suspicion. Perhaps he was well dressed, polite, or claimed to be offering help. The victims themselves might have willingly gotten into his car, trusting that he meant no harm. Seed Police Department. A task force was formed, bringing together detectives from multiple jurisdictions. They interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, followed up on thousands of tips, and worked around the clock to identify patterns. But the Freeway Phantom was careful. He left no fingerprints, no DNA evidence that could be processed with 1970s technology, and no witnesses who could provide a clear description. The case took an intriguing turn in 1977 when police arrested Robert Elwood Askins, a 58-year-old computer technician, for abducting and raping a 24-year-old woman. When detectives began investigating Askins' background, they uncovered a disturbing history. In 1938, when he was just 19 years old, Askins had served cyanide-laced whiskey to 5 prostitutes at a brothel, killing 31-year-old Ruth McDonald. He had literally been poisoning people for decades. When police searched Askins' home, they found court documents in a desk drawer. In these papers, a judge had used the word tantamount in a legal ruling. This was significant because tantamount was the unusual word that appeared in the note found on Brenda Woodard's body. Furthermore, the colleagues at the National Science Foundation, where Askins worked, reported that tantamount was a word that frequently appeared in his speech and writing. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. Askins had a history of violence against women dating back decades. He lived and worked in the area where the murders occurred. He had access to the unusual vocabulary found in the killer's note. Police obtained a search warrant and dug through his backyard, looking for physical evidence that could link him to the murders. They found nothing. Despite the suspicious circumstances, prosecutors never filed charges against Askins in connection with the Freeway Phantom murders. The evidence was circumstantial, and without physical proof linking him to the crimes, they couldn't build a case that would hold up in court. Askins remained in prison for other crimes until his death in 2010 at the age of 91, taking whatever secrets he might have had to his grave. See history. Over the years, case files were lost, evidence was misplaced, and institutional memory faded as detectives retired or passed away. Today, the case files are incomplete, with some having been discarded entirely and others missing crucial pages and evidence. The impact on the families of the victims cannot be overstated. For more than 50 years, they have lived without answers, without closure, without justice. Carol Spinks would be 65 years old today. Brenda Woodard would be 69. These were children with hopes, dreams, and futures that were brutally cut short by a predator who has never been held accountable for his crimes. The Freeway Phantom case also exposed the systemic inequalities in how law enforcement responds to crimes against different communities. Had 6 white girls from affluent neighborhoods been murdered in such a manner, the investigation would have received unlimited resources and national attention. Instead, these cases were treated as routine homicides in a city plagued by violence. Today, the case remains officially open as a cold case in the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division. A reward of $150,000 is still offered for information leading to the killer's identification and arrest. Advances in DNA technology have allowed investigators to re-examine some evidence from the original crime scenes, but decades of degradation and contamination have made meaningful analysis difficult. The Freeway Phantom murders serve as a stark reminder of how serial killers can operate with impunity when they target society's most vulnerable members. This killer understood that by choosing young black girls from poor neighborhoods, he was selecting victims whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts or media attention. He exploited not just individual vulnerabilities, but systemic ones as well. What makes this case particularly haunting is the killer's apparent intelligence and organization. The note left on Brenda Woodard's body wasn't the rambling of a deranged mind. It was a calculated psychological weapon designed to terrorize both the victim and the investigators who would find her. The killer's ability to operate for over a year without leaving meaningful evidence suggests someone with knowledge of police procedures and forensic science. The geographic pattern of the murders also suggests careful planning. Interstate 295 wasn't chosen randomly as a dumping ground. It was selected because it allowed the killer to dispose of bodies quickly while making a public statement. The highway cuts through multiple jurisdictions, which may have been intentional to complicate the investigation by forcing different police departments to coordinate their efforts. Perhaps most chilling of all is the possibility that the Freeway Phantom killed more victims than the 6 officially attributed to him. Serial killers rarely start and stop their activities so abruptly, and there may be other unsolved murders from the same time period that haven't been connected to this case. The killer's note promised to admit the others when caught, suggesting he was responsible for additional crimes beyond the 6 known victims. The families of the Freeway Phantom's victims continue to seek justice more than 5 decades after their loved ones were murdered. They have formed support groups, lobbied for renewed investigations, and kept their daughters' memories alive through community activism. Now we delve deeper into the twisted mind of Manuel Moore, one of the architects behind San Francisco's most terrifying chapter of racially motivated violence. Unlike the serial killers we've explored, who were driven by personal compulsions or individual psychological breaks, Moore represented something far more sinister: organized ideological hatred that transformed murder into a mission. Manuel Moore wasn't born a killer in the traditional sense. He was manufactured by a toxic combination of racial extremism, religious fanaticism, and systematic indoctrination that would make him one of the most dangerous men in 1970s America. Born in the rural South during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, Moore grew up witnessing the violent upheaval of a society grappling with centuries of racial injustice. But instead of finding hope in the possibility of equality, Moore found something else entirely: a twisted philosophy that would justify the most heinous acts imaginable. The transformation of Manuel Moore from ordinary citizen to cold-blooded killer began when he encountered the Death Angels, a splinter group within the Black Muslim movement that perverted religious teachings into a doctrine of racial warfare. This wasn't simply gang violence or random hatred. This was systematic, organized, and driven by a belief system that promised spiritual rewards for murdering white people. The Death Angels taught that killing white people, whom they called blue-eyed devils, would earn them wings in the afterlife. Each murder brought them closer to salvation in their warped theology. Moore embraced this ideology with the fervor of a true believer. He wasn't just participating in violence, he was conducting what he believed to be holy work. This religious component made Moore and his associates particularly dangerous because they weren't constrained by normal human empathy or moral boundaries. In their minds, they weren't committing crimes, they were fulfilling divine commandments. The zebra murders began in October 1973, and from the very first attack, it was clear that these weren't random acts of violence. The killers operated with military precision, selecting targets based solely on race and executing their plans with chilling efficiency. Moore and his fellow Death Angels would patrol San Francisco's streets in search of vulnerable white victims, particularly targeting those who were alone, elderly, or otherwise defenseless. The methodology was as calculated as it was brutal. The killers would approach their victims under the pretense of asking for directions or offering assistance. Once they had lured their target into a vulnerable position, they would strike with devastating swiftness. Some victims were shot at close range with sawed-off shotguns. Others were hacked to death with machetes. The weapons were chosen specifically for their ability to cause maximum trauma and ensure quick death. What made the zebra murders particularly terrifying was their complete randomness from the victim's perspective. Unlike other serial killings, where there might be some connection between killer and victim, these murders were purely racial. A white person could be walking down the street, minding their own business, living their life, and suddenly become a target simply because of the color of their skin. This randomness created a climate of fear that paralyzed San Francisco's white community. The first confirmed zebra murder occurred on October 19, 1973, when three young white men were approached by a group of black men who asked for a ride. When the victims agreed to help, they were driven to a remote location where they were forced to lie face down on the ground. The killers then executed them one by one with shots to the back of the head. Two died immediately. The third, Nick Shields, survived despite being shot and was able to provide investigators with their first real description of the killers. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 5 months, the Death Angels would claim at least 14 more lives in a campaign of terror that shocked even a city accustomed to violence. Each murder was more brazen than the last, as if the killers were testing how far they could push before law enforcement could stop them. On December 11, 1973, the killers struck again with particular viciousness. Art Agnos, who would later become mayor of San Francisco, was walking to his car when he was approached by two black men who asked for directions. When Agnos stopped to help, one of the men pulled out a shotgun and fired, hitting Agnos in the chest and arm. Agnos survived, but barely, and his testimony would later prove crucial in identifying the killers. The Death Angels weren't content with simply murdering adults. On December 20th, 1973, they targeted children, attacking a school bus and shooting two young girls. Both children survived, but the attack on innocents marked a new level of depravity that horrified even hardened investigators. The killers had crossed every moral boundary, proving that no one was safe from their twisted crusade. Throughout this reign of terror, Manuel Moore emerged as one of the group's most dedicated and ruthless members. He fully embraced the Death Angels ideology and participated in multiple murders with the enthusiasm of a true believer. Moore didn't just kill, he celebrated each death as a victory in what he saw as a holy war. He kept detailed records of the group's activities, treating murder like a business transaction that needed to be documented for spiritual accounting. The investigation into the zebra murders became one of the largest police operations in San Francisco history. The city deployed hundreds of officers, established special task forces, and even brought in federal agents to help crack the case. But the killers were careful, organized, and operating within a community that was initially reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement due to decades of police brutality and racial injustice. The breakthrough came when the police received a tip from within the Black Muslim community. Not all members of the religious community supported the Death Angel's extremist interpretation of their faith, and some were horrified by the murders being committed in the name of their religion. An informant provided investigators with crucial information about the group's structure, membership, and planned attacks. On May 1st, 1974, police simultaneously raided multiple locations across San Francisco, arresting 7 men in connection with the zebra murders. Manuel Moore was among those arrested, caught with evidence linking him directly to several of the killings. The evidence against him was overwhelming: witness identifications, ballistics evidence, and his own recorded statements bragging about the murders. During his interrogation, Moore showed no remorse for his actions. He remained defiant, claiming that he was a soldier in a righteous war and that his victims deserved to die because of their race. He spoke about the murders with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather, displaying a complete absence of human empathy that chilled even experienced detectives. The trial of Manuel Moore and his co-conspirators became a media sensation and a symbol of racial tensions in 1970s America. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt, including testimony from survivors, ballistics evidence linking their weapons to the crime scenes, and recorded conversations in which the defendants discussed their plans and celebrated their successes. Throughout the trial, Moore and his associates remained unrepentant. They used the courtroom as a platform to spread their hateful ideology, claiming that they were freedom fighters battling against white oppression. They showed no sympathy for their victims and expressed no regret for the pain they had caused to families and communities. The jury deliberated for several days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of first-degree murder. Manuel Moore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured he would never again be free to act on his twisted beliefs. The other convicted Death Angels received similar sentences, effectively dismantling the organization and ending their reign of terror. But the impact of the zebra murders extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The killings exposed deep racial divisions in American society and demonstrated how extremist ideologies could transform ordinary people into instruments of terror. The case also highlighted the challenge of combating organized hate groups that operate under the cover of religious or political movements. Manuel Moore spent the rest of his life behind bars, never expressing remorse for his crimes or abandoning the ideology that had driven him to murder. He died in prison in 2017 at the age of 73, taking with him the secrets of other potential victims and attacks that were never fully investigated. Even in death, he remained a symbol of how hatred and extremism can corrupt the human soul and lead to unimaginable violence. The legacy of Manuel Moore and the zebra murders serves as a stark reminder that evil can take many forms. While we often think of serial killers as lone wolves driven by personal demons, Moore represents a different kind of monster, one created by organized hatred, sustained by twisted ideology, and motivated by the belief that murder is not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. His story demonstrates that some of the most dangerous killers are those who believe they are doing God's work, even as they commit the most ungodly acts imaginable. The zebra murders remain one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, not just because of the number of victims or the brutality of the crimes, but because they represent the deadly potential of racial hatred when it becomes organized, systematized, and sanctified by extremist ideology. As the investigation into the Freeway Phantom murders dragged on year after year, another kind of evil was taking root on the opposite side of the country. In the early 1970s, the streets of San Francisco became hunting grounds for a group of men whose crimes were so calculated, so ideologically driven, that they sent shockwaves through American society. They called themselves the Death Angels, but the city knew them by another name, the Zebra Killers. Manuel Moore was born into a world that had already taught him to hate. Growing up in the racially charged atmosphere of 1960s America, Moore found himself drawn to the radical fringes of the Black Muslim movement. But this wasn't about civil rights or social justice. This was something far darker. Moore and his associates believed they were soldiers in a holy war, and their battlefield was the streets of San Francisco. The Death Angels operated under a twisted religious ideology that promised salvation through murder. According to their perverted beliefs, killing white people wasn't just acceptable, it was a sacred duty. Each murder earned them points in some cosmic game, bringing them closer to their version of paradise. A white woman was worth 5 points, a white man was worth 4, a white child was worth 1. They kept score like it was a game, but the victims were real, and their deaths were horrific. Moore's first confirmed kill happened on a foggy October night in 1973. Richard Haig and his wife Quita were walking home from dinner when a van pulled up beside them. The men inside called out, asking for directions. When Richard approached to help, Moore shot him in the face at point-blank range. Quita screamed and tried to run, but they caught her, dragged her into the van, and drove to a remote location where they hacked at her with machetes and left her for dead. Somehow, miraculously, she survived. Her testimony would later become crucial evidence, but at the time, police had no idea they were dealing with an organized group of killers. The attacks escalated quickly. 3 months later, on Christmas Eve 1973, Moore and his accomplices struck again. They abducted 19-year-old Linda Story and 20-year-old Tom Bates as they walked through Golden Gate Park. Both were shot execution style and left in the park like discarded trash. The randomness of it terrified the city. These weren't crimes of passion or even robbery gone wrong. These were executions carried out with military precision and chilling indifference. What made the Zebra murders particularly horrifying was their systematic nature. The killers didn't hunt impulsively. They planned their attacks, scouted locations, and selected victims based purely on skin color. They drove through white neighborhoods in stolen vehicles, looking for isolated targets. They carried multiple weapons and had escape routes planned. This wasn't the work of deranged individuals acting alone. This was organized terrorism. The psychological impact on San Francisco was devastating. White residents became afraid to leave their homes after dark. The city's thriving nightlife ground to a halt as people canceled plans and avoided public spaces. Sales of guns and security systems skyrocketed. The very fabric of the city began to tear apart as racial tensions reached a boiling point. But the killers weren't finished. On January 15th, 1974, they murdered Tana Smith, a 25-year-old woman waiting for a bus. She was shot 4 times in the back as she tried to run away. 2 weeks later, they killed Vincent Wallen, a 69-year-old janitor walking home from work. In April, they murdered Thomas Rainwater and Linda Story, both shot while walking through their own neighborhood. Each murder was more brazen than the last, as if the killers were taunting the police to stop them. The investigation became the largest manhunt in San Francisco history. Police worked around the clock, following hundreds of leads and interviewing thousands of suspects. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources to bear on what was clearly a case of domestic terrorism. But the killers were careful, disciplined, and motivated by an ideology that made them willing to die for their cause. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Anthony Harris, a member of the Death Angels who had participated in some of the earlier murders, began to have second thoughts about the group's activities. The constant killing was taking a psychological toll, and he started to fear for his own safety within the organization. In May 1974, Harris walked into a San Francisco police station and confessed everything. Harris's testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The Death Angels weren't just a local group of criminals. They were part of a larger network that stretched across multiple cities, with cells operating in Los Angeles, Oakland, and other urban centers. They had been responsible for far more murders than anyone had suspected, killing not just in San Francisco, but throughout California. The arrest came swiftly after Harris's confession. Simon and Jesse Lee Cooks. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Ballistics tests linked their weapons to multiple crime scenes. Eyewitness testimony placed them at the scenes of several murders. Most damning of all was Harris's detailed account of their activities, corroborated by physical evidence and police surveillance. During the trial, the full horror of the Death Angels' ideology was revealed. Prosecutors presented evidence that the group had killed at least 15 people, with more personally responsible for at least 5 murders. The defendants showed no remorse, viewing themselves as martyrs for their cause. They refused to cooperate with authorities and maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The courtroom became a stage for their twisted beliefs. Moore and his co-defendants used their time on the witness stand to preach their racial hatred, turning the trial into a platform for their extremist ideology. They spoke of white people as devils who deserved to die, and of themselves as holy warriors carrying out God's will. Their complete lack of humanity was chilling to witness. The psychological evaluation of Manuel Moore revealed a man consumed by hatred and delusion. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by personal psychological compulsions, Moore was motivated by ideology. He genuinely believed that murdering innocent people was not only justified but morally required. This ideological framework allowed him to commit horrific acts without the guilt or psychological breakdown that often affects other killers. What made Moore particularly dangerous was his ability to recruit others and maintain group discipline. The Death Angels operated like a military unit, with clear chains of command and shared objectives. Moore wasn't just a killer, he was a leader who could inspire others to kill. This organizational ability made him far more dangerous than a lone wolf predator. The trial lasted for months, with prosecutors methodically building their case through forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the detailed confessions of Anthony Harris. The defense attempted to argue that their clients were being persecuted for their religious beliefs, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Manuel Moore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in California healthcare facility in Stockton on November 15, 2017, at the age of 73. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, maintaining until the end that he had been fighting a righteous war. The zebra murders exposed the dangerous intersection of racial hatred and religious extremism in American society. Unlike other serial killers who are driven by personal pathology, Moore and his associates were motivated by a coherent, if twisted, worldview that justified the most heinous acts imaginable. They represent a particularly chilling form of evil, organized, ideological, and utterly without mercy. The case also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces when dealing with organized terrorist groups operating within American borders. The Death Angels used sophisticated tactics, maintained operational security, and were willing to die for their cause. They were, in many ways, more dangerous than traditional organized crime because they weren't motivated by profit but by ideology. The impact of the zebra murders extended far beyond San Francisco. The case became a watershed moment in American law enforcement's understanding of domestic terrorism. It demonstrated that ideologically motivated violence could emerge from any community, and that racial hatred could inspire systematic campaigns of murder just as effectively as political or religious extremism. Today, the zebra murders serve as a stark reminder of how quickly civilization can break down when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. Manuel Moore and his associates didn't emerge from nowhere. They were products of a society struggling with racial tension, economic inequality, and social fragmentation. Their crimes were extreme, but the conditions that created them were depressingly familiar. The victims of the zebra murders were ordinary people going about their daily lives. They were workers heading home, couples out for dinner, students walking through parks. Their only crime was being in the wrong place, at the wrong time with the wrong skin color. We now turn to the final figure in our exploration of history's most terrifying killers, and perhaps the most controversial of all. Elizabeth Bathory, known as the Blood Countess, represents something unique in the annals of evil, a figure whose story has been so twisted by legend and myth that separating fact from fiction becomes nearly impossible. Yet what we do know about her case reveals something deeply disturbing about power, privilege, and the lengths to which those in authority will go to destroy someone who threatens their interests. Born in 1560, into the powerful House of Bathory in Hungary, Elizabeth was not some deranged peasant or drifter like the other killers we've examined. She was nobility, educated in multiple languages, wealthy beyond measure, and connected to the highest levels of European aristocracy. Her uncle was Stephen Bathory, who became King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. This was a woman who owned vast estates, commanded armies of servants, and wielded influence that extended across the Kingdom of Hungary. The allegations against her were staggering in their scope and brutality. According to the charges brought in 1610, Elizabeth Bathory had tortured and murdered over 600 girls and women over a period of 20 years, from 1590 to 1610. The accusations painted her as a sadistic monster who derived pleasure from inflicting unimaginable pain on young women, primarily servants and peasant girls who worked on her estates. Witnesses testified that she would beat her victims with clubs, burn them with hot irons, freeze them naked in the snow, and subject them to tortures so severe that many died from the pain alone. But here's where Elizabeth Bathory's story becomes truly fascinating and deeply troubling. The most famous legend associated with her, the one that has endured for centuries and made her a figure of horror literature and vampire mythology, is that she bathed in the blood of virgins to maintain her youth and beauty. This image of the blood countess, standing in a tub filled with human blood, has captured imaginations for generations. There's only one problem with this story. It's almost certainly not true. The blood-bathing legend didn't appear in any contemporary accounts of her trial or in any witness testimony from the time. The first mention of Elizabeth bathing in blood appears in a work by Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarozzi, written in 1729, over a century after her death. By then, the real Elizabeth Bathory had been dead for more than 100 years, and her story had been filtered through generations of storytelling, religious fear-mongering, and sensationalized accounts that bore little resemblance to historical fact. So what really happened to Elizabeth Bathory? Modern historians have increasingly questioned whether she was guilty of the crimes attributed to her or whether she was the victim of one of history's most successful character assassinations. The evidence suggests something far more complex and politically motivated than a simple case of serial murder. Elizabeth's troubles began after the death of her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, in 1604. Ferenc had been a powerful military commander, and his death left Elizabeth as one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Hungary. She owned vast estates, controlled enormous wealth, and perhaps most threatening of all to the male-dominated power structure of the time, she was educating young women to read and may have even owned a printing press. In an era when literacy among women was rare and often viewed with suspicion, Elizabeth's actions were revolutionary and subversive. The investigation into Elizabeth's alleged crimes was ordered by King Matthias of Hungary and carried out by her own cousin, György Thurzó, the Count Palatine of Hungary. But King Matthias had a significant financial interest in seeing Elizabeth destroyed. She had loaned the crown enormous sums of money, debts that would be conveniently erased if she were found guilty of crimes and her estates confiscated. György Thurzó, despite being her cousin, also stood to benefit from her downfall, as he would likely gain control of her lands and wealth. The investigation itself was deeply flawed by any modern standard. The supposed evidence consisted primarily of testimony from servants who were tortured to extract confessions, witness accounts from people who lived in the area but may never have actually seen the alleged crimes, and hearsay that had been circulating for years. No physical evidence was ever presented. No bodies were produced. No crime scenes were documented. The entire case rested on testimony that would be thrown out of any modern court as unreliable and coerced. When Elizabeth was arrested on December 30th, 1609, she was not given a trial. Instead, her servants were put on trial in 1611, and 3 of them were executed after confessing under torture to participating in the murders. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried or convicted. She was simply imprisoned in her own castle at Chaktiche, where she remained until her death in 1614. This unusual treatment for someone accused of such heinous crimes suggests that even her accusers knew the case against her was weak. The political motivations behind Elizabeth's persecution become even clearer when we examine what happened to her wealth after her imprisonment. Her vast estates were divided among her accusers and their allies. The debts owed by the crown were declared void. The powerful woman who had threatened the established order was neutralized, and those who orchestrated her downfall profited enormously from her destruction. But there's another aspect of Elizabeth Bathory's story that makes it particularly relevant to our examination of evil throughout history. Whether she was guilty of the crimes attributed to her or not, her case demonstrates how the label of monster can be weaponized against those who challenge power structures. The image of Elizabeth as a blood-drinking vampire countess has proven so compelling that it has overshadowed any serious historical analysis of her case for centuries. This is not to say that Elizabeth Bathory was necessarily innocent. Some historians believe that while the scale of the crimes attributed to her was likely exaggerated, she may have been guilty of some violence against her servants. The treatment of servants by nobility in 16th and 17th century Hungary was often brutal, and physical punishment, even leading to death, was not uncommon. What made Elizabeth's case different was not necessarily the nature of the alleged crimes, but the political necessity of destroying her. The story of Elizabeth Bathory reveals something deeply unsettling about how history is written and who gets to tell it. For centuries, she has been portrayed as one of history's most evil women, a sadistic killer who bathed in blood to maintain her beauty. But this image was created by her enemies, spread by those who benefited from her destruction, and perpetuated by writers and filmmakers who found the vampire countess narrative too compelling to question. What makes Elizabeth Bathory's case so relevant to our understanding of evil is that it shows how the accusation of evil can itself become a tool of evil. Whether she was guilty or innocent, the methods used to destroy her, the confessions extracted through torture, the kangaroo court proceedings, and the seizure of her wealth represent a different kind of evil, the evil of institutional power turned against an individual who posed a threat to the established order. The real Elizabeth Bathory died alone in her castle prison in 1614, 4 years after her arrest. She was 54 years old, and by all accounts, she maintained her innocence until the end. Her story serves as a reminder that the label of monster should always be examined carefully, especially when it's applied to those who challenge power, who threaten established interests, or who simply have something that others want to take. In examining these 5 figures, Samuel Mason, Larry Eiler, the Freeway Phantom, Manuel Moore, and Elizabeth Bathory, we see different faces of evil throughout history. Some represent the chaos of the frontier, where law and order barely existed, Others show us the horror of ideological extremism and racial hatred. Still others demonstrate how institutional failures can allow predators to operate with impunity. And in the case of Elizabeth Bathory, we see how the accusation of evil can itself become a weapon of destruction. These stories matter not because they satisfy some morbid curiosity about human darkness, but because they teach us about the conditions that allow evil to flourish. They show us the importance of strong institutions, the danger of unchecked power, and the need to question official narratives, especially when they serve the interests of those in power. Now let's delve into the twisted mind of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, whose legend has endured for over 4 centuries as one of history's most chilling tales of aristocratic evil. Born into Hungarian nobility in 1560, Bathory's story represents the darkest intersection of power, privilege, and alleged depravity that would make her name synonymous with vampiric horror. Elizabeth Bathory came from one of the most powerful families in the Kingdom of Hungary. The Bathory lineage was steeped in both prestige and violence, with her uncle Stephen Bathory serving as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. This was a family accustomed to wielding absolute power over life and death, where the lives of peasants and servants were considered expendable commodities in the pursuit of political and personal objectives. From her earliest years, Elizabeth displayed troubling signs that would later be interpreted as harbingers of her alleged crimes. She suffered from seizures that may have been epileptic in nature, and the medieval treatments she received involved the application of blood from healthy individuals to her lips and consumption of blood mixed with human skull fragments. These early exposures to blood as medicine may have planted the seeds for the grotesque rituals she would later be accused of performing. Educated in multiple languages, including Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek, Elizabeth was no ignorant savage. She was highly intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a sharp political mind that understood the intricacies of power in Renaissance Europe. This intelligence would later serve her in maintaining her alleged crimes for decades without detection, using her noble status as both shield and weapon against those who might dare to question her activities. In 1575, at the age of 15, Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman known for his military prowess and brutal efficiency in warfare. Ferenc was called the Black Knight of Hungary, a man who took particular pleasure in devising new methods of torture for captured enemies. Under his tutelage, Elizabeth allegedly learned techniques of cruelty that would later be applied to her own victims. The marriage was as much a political alliance as a romantic union, combining two of Hungary's most powerful and ruthless families. During Ferenc's frequent military campaigns, Elizabeth was left to manage their vast estates, which included multiple castles and hundreds of servants. It was during these periods of isolation and absolute authority that the first whispers of her cruelty began to emerge. Servants spoke in hushed tones of brutal punishments for minor infractions, of young girls who arrived at the castle and were never seen again, of screams echoing through the corridors at night that chilled the blood of anyone who heard them. The allegations against Elizabeth Bathory are staggering in their scope and brutality. She was accused of torturing and murdering over 600 young women, primarily peasant girls and minor nobility who served in her household. The methods of torture described in historical accounts are almost too horrific to comprehend. Victims were allegedly beaten with clubs, burned with hot irons, bitten on the face and other body parts, frozen to death by being dragged naked into snow, and subjected to various forms of sexual torture. The most infamous legend surrounding Elizabeth involves her alleged practice of bathing in the blood of virgin girls to preserve her youth and beauty. According to this tale, she discovered the rejuvenating properties of human blood when she struck a servant girl and noticed that where the blood splattered on her skin, it appeared more youthful and vibrant. This supposed revelation led to the construction of elaborate blood-draining apparatus and bathing chambers where she would immerse herself in the life essence of her victims. However, modern historical scholarship has increasingly questioned the veracity of these blood-bathing stories. The tale of bathing in virgin blood didn't appear in any contemporary accounts of her trial or in the testimonies of witnesses. It first surfaced in print over a century after her death in the work of Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarocci in 1729. This significant gap between the alleged events and their first recorded mention suggests that the blood-bathing legend may be more myth than reality. The downfall of Elizabeth Bathory began in 1609, when reports of her activities reached King Matthias II of Hungary. The king ordered György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and Elizabeth's own cousin, to investigate the allegations. What Thurzo discovered during his investigation was apparently so damning that immediate action was required. On December 30th, 1609, Thurzo led a raid on Chaktich Castle, Elizabeth's primary residence. The scene that greeted the investigators was allegedly one of unimaginable horror. They reportedly found the castle littered with corpses in various stages of decomposition, torture devices still stained with blood, and evidence of ongoing atrocities. Elizabeth was found in the castle along with 4 of her servants who were accused of being her accomplices in the murders. The servants were arrested alongside their mistress, and their subsequent confessions would provide much of the evidence used against Elizabeth. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Hungarian history. The 4 servants were subjected to torture and interrogation, during which they confessed to participating in the murders and torture of hundreds of young women. They described in graphic detail the methods used to kill the victims, the disposal of bodies, and Elizabeth's personal involvement in the atrocities. Based on these confessions and the testimony of surviving witnesses, the court concluded that Elizabeth had indeed committed the crimes of which she was accused. However, Elizabeth herself never faced formal trial. As a member of the high nobility, she was protected by ancient privileges that prevented her from being subjected to the same legal proceedings as her servants. Instead, she was condemned to life imprisonment within the walls of her own castle. The 4 servants were not so fortunate. 3 were executed, with 2 being burned alive after having their fingers torn off with red-hot pincers, while the 3rd was beheaded. The 4th servant, being younger and considered less culpable, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elizabeth's imprisonment was absolute and cruel. She was walled up alive in a set of rooms within Chaktich Castle, with only small slots left open for the passage of food and air. For nearly 4 years, she lived in this stone tomb, cut off from all human contact except for the guards who brought her meager meals. She died on August 21st, 1614, at the age of 54, found dead in her cell by guards who had come to deliver her food. Yet even as Elizabeth Bathory's life ended in isolation and disgrace, questions about her guilt began to emerge. Modern historians have proposed that Elizabeth may have been the victim of a complex political conspiracy designed to seize her vast wealth and holdings. She was one of the richest landowners in Hungary, possessing estates that rivaled those of the royal family itself. Her wealth made her a target for those who sought to consolidate power and eliminate potential threats to the established order. The timing of the charges against Elizabeth is particularly suspicious. They emerged just as King Matthias II was facing financial difficulties and needed to seize assets to fund his military campaigns. Elizabeth's estates represented a fortune that could solve many of the kingdom's fiscal problems. By convicting her of heinous crimes, the crown could justify the confiscation of her property while appearing to serve justice rather than pursuing naked greed. Furthermore, Elizabeth's position as a powerful woman in a male-dominated society made her a natural target for those who felt threatened by her independence and influence. She had successfully managed vast estates, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of servants, and maintained her family's political prominence even after her husband's death. In an era when women were expected to be subservient and dependent, Elizabeth's autonomy and power challenged the natural order of things. Some historians have also pointed to evidence that Elizabeth may have been involved in activities that were considered subversive by the authorities of her time. There are suggestions that she taught young women to read and write, and may have even owned a printing press. In an era when literacy among women was considered dangerous and potentially heretical, such activities would have been viewed as threats to social stability and religious orthodoxy. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory has endured and evolved over the centuries, becoming intertwined with vampire folklore and Gothic horror. She has been portrayed in countless books, films, and other media as the archetypal female monster, a figure of aristocratic evil who embodied the worst excesses of feudal power. The image of the Blood Countess bathing in virgin blood has become one of the most enduring and chilling legends in European folklore. However, the persistence of these legends may say more about our collective fascination with female evil than about the historical reality of Elizabeth Bathory's crimes. The figure of the murderous noblewoman, using her beauty and privilege to lure innocent victims to their doom, taps into deep-seated fears about the corruption of power and the potential for evil that lurks beneath civilized society's veneer. Whether Elizabeth Bathory was truly guilty of the crimes attributed to her, or was the victim of a political conspiracy designed to destroy her, her story serves as a powerful reminder of how accusations of evil can be weaponized by those in power. The line between justice and persecution can be razor thin, particularly when vast wealth and political influence are at stake. Her case demonstrates how easily historical narratives can be shaped by the agendas of those who control the records and write the official accounts. The truth about Elizabeth Bathory may never be fully known. The evidence against her comes primarily from confessions extracted under torture and from witnesses whose testimony may have been coerced or influenced by political considerations. The most sensational aspects of her legend, including the blood-bathing rituals that made her famous, appear to be later additions to her story, rather than contemporary accounts of her activities. What remains undeniable is that Elizabeth Bathory's story continues to fascinate and horrify audiences more than 4 centuries after her death. Whether she was a genuine monster who used her noble privilege to commit unspeakable atrocities, or a powerful woman who was destroyed by those who feared her independence and coveted her wealth, her legend serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which accusations of evil can be used to destroy those who pose a threat to the established order. The story of Elizabeth Bathory reminds us that the most effective evil often wears the mace of respectability and operates within the structures of legitimate authority. Whether her crimes were real or fabricated, they illustrate how power can corrupt and how the vulnerable can become victims of those who possess the means to harm them with impunity. Our journey through the darkest corners of human evil continues. We've seen how respected war heroes can transform into ruthless killers, how methodical predators can hunt their victims across state lines, and how society's most vulnerable can become targets for monsters hiding in plain sight. But perhaps no case illustrates the complex intersection of power, privilege, and accusations of evil quite like our final subject. Elizabeth Bathory lived in an era when a woman's fate could be sealed not just by her actions, but by the ambitions of those who sought to destroy her. Born into Hungarian nobility in 1560, she entered a world where bloodlines determined destiny and where the powerful could reshape truth itself to serve their purposes. The House of Bathory was among the most influential families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Bathory, ruled the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as both King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Her family controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and wielded political influence that stretched across Eastern Europe. From birth, Elizabeth was destined for a life of privilege and power that most could never imagine. Yet even privilege could not shield her from the brutal realities of her time. As a child, Elizabeth suffered from seizures that modern historians believe may have been epilepsy. The medical treatments of the era were barbaric by today's standards. Physicians would rub the blood of healthy individuals on the lips of epileptic patients, believing this would cure their condition. Some treatments involved forcing patients to drink mixtures of blood and ground human skull fragments. These early exposures to blood-based remedies would later fuel the most enduring legends about Elizabeth's alleged crimes. At 15, Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman known for his military prowess and his particularly cruel methods of warfare. Ferenc was called the Black Knight of Hungary, and his reputation for brutality in battle was legendary. While he waged war against the Ottoman Empire, Elizabeth managed their vast estates, wielding authority that was unusual for women of her era. She learned to read and write in multiple languages, managed complex financial affairs, and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of servants and soldiers. But Ferenc's influence on Elizabeth may have extended beyond mere estate management. He was known to torture prisoners of war, and some accounts suggest he taught Elizabeth techniques for inflicting pain on servants who displeased her. Whether these stories are true or merely later fabrications designed to build a case against her remains a matter of historical debate. After Ferenc's death in 1604, Elizabeth became one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Hungary. She controlled vast territories, commanded private armies, and possessed wealth that rivaled that of kings. For a brief moment, she represented something dangerous in the rigid hierarchy of feudal Europe, a woman with independent power who answered to no man. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, though historians now question whether what followed was justice or conspiracy. In 1609, Count Georgi Thurzo, acting on orders from King Matthias of Hungary, launched an investigation into Elizabeth's activities. The accusations that emerged were beyond horrific. Elizabeth was charged with torturing and murdering over 600 young women, primarily peasant girls, who worked as servants in her castles. The alleged methods of torture were described in graphic detail. Victims were said to have been beaten, burned, bitten, starved, and mutilated. Some were allegedly forced to stand naked in the snow until they froze to death. Others were reportedly covered in honey and left for insects to devour alive. But the most enduring legend surrounding Elizabeth Bathory involves blood. According to stories that emerged more than a century after her death, Elizabeth believed that bathing in the blood of young virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. These tales describe elaborate rituals where Elizabeth would drain the blood of her victims and immerse herself in it, believing it would grant her eternal youth. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. Elizabeth's servants were tortured until they confessed to participating in the murders. 3 were executed immediately. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried, but was instead walled up alive in her own castle, left with only small openings for food and air. She died 4 years later in 1614, having never left her makeshift prison. For centuries, this version of events was accepted as historical fact. Elizabeth Bathory became known as the Blood Countess, one of history's most prolific serial killers, and a symbol of aristocratic excess and cruelty. Her story inspired countless books, films, and legends about vampires and blood-drinking nobility. But modern scholarship has revealed a far more complex and troubling truth. Beginning in the 1980s, historians began examining the evidence against Elizabeth with fresh eyes, and what they found suggested something sinister was at work, but perhaps not what history had recorded. The investigation into Elizabeth's alleged crimes was led by Georgi Thurzo, but Thurzo had powerful motives beyond justice. Elizabeth was enormously wealthy, and King Matthias owed her substantial debts. If Elizabeth could be convicted of crimes against the crown, her property would be forfeited and the king's debts would be erased. More troubling still, the methods used to gather evidence against Elizabeth followed patterns typical of political persecution rather than legitimate criminal investigation. Her servants were tortured until they provided the testimony their interrogators wanted to hear. No independent witnesses came forward. No physical evidence was preserved. The most damning testimonies came from people who had clear incentives to lie or who were coerced into providing statements. Perhaps most significantly, the famous blood-bathing stories that have defined Elizabeth's legend for centuries appear nowhere in the original trial records. These tales first appeared in print in 1729, more than a century after Elizabeth's death, in the work of Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarozzi. No witness from her trial ever mentioned bloodbaths or vampiric rituals. The most iconic elements of Elizabeth Bathory's supposed crimes appear to be complete fabrications, added to her story long after anyone who knew the truth was dead. Recent scholarship has revealed another troubling possibility. Elizabeth may have been targeted not just for her wealth, but for activities that challenged the social order of her time. Evidence suggests she taught many young women to read and write, radical acts in an era when female literacy was seen as dangerous. Some historians believe she may have owned a printing press, another subversive activity that would have alarmed religious and political authorities. In a world where women were expected to be silent and obedient, Elizabeth Bathory was wealthy, educated, independent, and influential. She represented a threat to the established order that went far beyond any individual crimes she may have committed. This doesn't mean Elizabeth was entirely innocent. The historical record suggests she was likely cruel to her servants, possibly to an extreme degree. Physical punishment of servants was common among the nobility of her era, and Elizabeth may have taken such practices to sadistic extremes. Some servants may indeed have died as a result of her cruelty, but the scale of the crimes attributed to her, the systematic nature of the alleged murders, and the most sensational details of her supposed blood rituals all appear to be exaggerations or complete fabrications designed to justify her destruction. The case of Elizabeth Bathory reveals how accusations of evil can become tools of power themselves. Her story demonstrates how legends can grow around real people, transforming them into monsters that serve the needs of those who tell their stories. Whether Elizabeth was a serial killer, a victim of political conspiracy, or something in between, her case shows us how difficult it can be to separate truth from propaganda, especially when the stakes involve vast wealth and political power. What makes Elizabeth's story particularly chilling is not just the possibility that she committed horrific crimes, but the equal possibility that she was destroyed by a system that found her independence more threatening than any actual wrongdoing. In a world where women had few rights and little power, Elizabeth Bathory possessed both. That alone may have been enough to seal her fate. The Blood Countess legend has endured for over 4 centuries, inspiring countless works of fiction and serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. But the real lesson of Elizabeth Bathory's story may be more complex and more disturbing than the simple narrative of a noble monster. Moving beyond the shadows of Highway 61, where Larry Ayler's predatory instincts led him to become one of the Midwest's most systematic killers, we encounter a case that would forever change how law enforcement approaches serial investigations. Ayler's methodical approach to murder was disturbing not just for its brutality, but for the calculated precision with which he selected and disposed of his victims. His Ford pickup truck became a mobile killing machine, prowling the interstate highways between Chicago and Indianapolis, searching for vulnerable young men who would never make it home. What made Ayler particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into the fabric of American highway culture. Truck stops, rest areas, and the anonymous stretches of interstate became hunting grounds where he could disappear into the flow of traffic after each attack. His victims were chosen not for any personal connection, but simply because they were available, vulnerable, and unlikely to be immediately missed. The restraints found on victims, the careful staging of bodies, and the systematic removal of identification all pointed to a killer who had refined his methods through repetition. The investigation into Ayler's crimes revealed the challenges law enforcement faced when dealing with killers who operated across state lines. Different jurisdictions, varying investigative protocols, and the simple logistics of coordinating between multiple agencies allowed Eiler to continue his killing spree far longer than should have been possible. His arrest came only after a former lover's suspicions led investigators to examine his background more closely, revealing the 1978 assault that matched his later crimes perfectly. In his final years, dying of AIDS in an Illinois prison, Eiler provided a posthumous confession that brought closure to families who had waited years for answers. But his legacy extends beyond the individual murders he committed. His case helped establish protocols for multi-jurisdictional investigations and highlighted the vulnerability of transient populations to predatory violence. The highways that Eiler used as his killing fields continue to carry millions of travelers each year, most unaware of the darkness that once stalked those same roads. His crimes serve as a reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, that predators can hide in plain sight among the mundane traffic of daily life. See, during the early 1970s, where a different kind of terror was unfolding. The Freeway Phantom represents one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in American criminal history, targeting young African American girls in the nation's capital during a period of significant social upheaval. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 victims between the ages of 10 and 18 were kidnapped, murdered, and left along Interstate 295, earning the unknown killer his chilling moniker. The systematic nature of these crimes revealed a predator who understood the vulnerabilities of his chosen victims. Many from families struggling with poverty were selected not randomly, but with terrifying precision. The killer seemed to understand that these victims came from communities where resources were limited, where police response might be slower, and where media attention would be minimal. The most disturbing aspect of the Freeway Phantom case was the psychological manipulation the killer exercised over his victims. The note found with Brenda Woodward's body, dictated by the killer but written in her own hand, reveals a level of control that went beyond physical violence. The words, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women," suggest someone who was not only aware of the pain he was causing, but took pleasure in forcing his victims to participate in documenting their own final moments. Despite extensive investigations and the identification of potential suspects like Robert Askins, the Freeway Phantom's identity remains unknown. The case files have been compromised over the decades, with crucial evidence lost or destroyed, making resolution increasingly unlikely. The $150,000 reward remains unclaimed, a testament to a killer who managed to terrorize a community and then vanish into history. The victims of the Freeway Phantom were not just statistics in a criminal investigation. They were daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cut short by a predator who targeted them specifically because of their vulnerability. Their deaths highlighted the systemic inequalities that made some victims more expendable than others in the eyes of both the killer and, tragically, sometimes the system meant to protect them. The investigation's failures also reveal the limitations of 1970s police work, particularly when it came to crimes against marginalized communities. The lack of resources, the absence of modern forensic techniques, and the social dynamics that made these particular victims less likely to receive immediate attention all contributed to the killer's ability to operate with impunity. Today, the case remains open as a cold case, with periodic reviews yielding no substantial new leads. The families of the victims have had to live with decades of uncertainty, never knowing if the person who destroyed their loved ones is still alive, still free, or has taken his secrets to the grave. The freeway phantom stands as a reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that some monsters manage to escape the consequences of their actions entirely. C. To the ideologically motivated violence of San Francisco in the 1970s, we encounter Manuel Moore and the Zebra Murders, a case that exposed the deadly intersection of racial hatred and systematic violence. Moore was a key figure in what became known as the Zebra Killings, a series of racially motivated attacks that terrorized San Francisco between 1973 and 1974. The Zebra Murders were unlike other serial killing cases because they were driven not by individual psychological compulsions, but by a twisted ideology that justified murder based solely on racial identity. Manuel Moore and his associates were members of a radical black nationalist group that targeted white victims in random attacks designed to spread terror throughout the white community. The seemingly random nature of these attacks made them particularly frightening, as victims were selected purely based on their race rather than any personal connection to the killers. What distinguished the Zebra Murders from other racially motivated crimes was their systematic nature. These were not spontaneous acts of violence born from immediate confrontation, but carefully planned attacks executed as part of a broader campaign of racial terrorism. The killers moved through San Francisco with deadly purpose, seeking out victims who fit their racial profile and attacking them with shocking brutality. The investigation into the Zebra Murders required unprecedented cooperation between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. The case highlighted the challenges of investigating ideologically motivated crimes, where traditional investigative techniques focused on personal motives and connections proved inadequate. The racial component of the crimes also created additional tensions within the community as fear and suspicion spread along racial lines. Manuel Moore's involvement in these murders demonstrates how ideological extremism can manifest in the most brutal forms of criminal behavior. Unlike killers driven by personal psychological issues, Moore and his associates were motivated by a worldview that dehumanized their victims based on race. This ideological framework allowed them to justify acts of extreme violence as part of a larger struggle, removing the moral barriers that typically prevent such behavior. The arrest and prosecution of Moore and his co-conspirators marked a significant victory for law enforcement, but the case also revealed the complex social and racial dynamics that could contribute to such extreme violence. The Zebra Murders occurred during a period of significant racial tension in American society, and while this context doesn't excuse the killer's actions, it helps explain how such radical ideologies could find fertile ground. Moore's death in prison in 2017 marked the end of a life that had been consumed by racial hatred and violence. His crimes serve as a stark reminder of how ideological extremism can lead individuals to commit acts of unimaginable brutality against innocent people. The Zebra Murders remain a dark chapter in San Francisco's history, demonstrating how racial hatred can manifest in systematic campaigns of terror that traumatize entire communities. Finally, we turn to perhaps the most controversial figure in our examination of evil, Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian noblewoman whose legend as the Blood Countess has endured for centuries. Born into the powerful House of Bathory in 1560, Elizabeth's story represents a complex intersection of historical fact, political intrigue, and mythological embellishment that continues to fascinate and horrify people more than 400 years after her death. The traditional narrative of Elizabeth Bathory paints her as one of history's most prolific serial killers, allegedly responsible for the torture and murder of hundreds of young women. According to these accounts, she killed her victims in elaborate rituals, bathing in their blood in a twisted attempt to preserve her youth and beauty. The image of the Blood Countess, surrounded by the corpses of innocent girls, has become one of the most enduring symbols of feminine evil in popular culture. However, modern scholarship has increasingly questioned this narrative, suggesting that Elizabeth Bathory may have been the victim of a sophisticated political conspiracy rather than a serial killer. The charges against her emerged during a period when her vast wealth and extensive land holdings made her a threat to the Hungarian power structure. Her husband's death had left her as one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the kingdom, a position that made her numerous enemies among the nobility and royal court. The investigation into Bathory's alleged crimes was led by her own cousin, Georgi Thurzo, who had significant financial and political motivations for bringing her down. The testimonies against her came primarily from servants under torture and local peasants who may have been coerced or incentivized to provide damaging statements. The lack of contemporary documentation supporting the most sensational aspects of her legend, particularly the blood-bathing rituals, suggests that these elements may have been later additions to her story. What makes Elizabeth Bathory's case particularly significant is how it demonstrates the dangerous intersection of misogyny and political opportunism. As a powerful woman in a male-dominated society, she represented a threat to established power structures. Her alleged crimes provided the perfect justification for seizing her wealth and neutralizing her influence, while the sexual and supernatural elements of the accusations tapped into deep-seated fears about female power and sexuality. The legend of the Blood Countess also reveals how stories of female evil are constructed and perpetuated differently than those of male criminals. Where male killers are often portrayed as products of their circumstances or victims of mental illness, female killers are more likely to be depicted as inherently monstrous, their crimes attributed to vanity, jealousy, or supernatural malevolence. The persistence of the blood-bathing myth, despite its lack of historical foundation, demonstrates how these gendered narratives can overshadow historical fact. If the modern scholarly interpretation is correct, then Elizabeth Bathory represents not a monster, but a victim of one of history's most successful character assassinations. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about how accusations of evil can be weaponized against those who threaten established power structures, and how historical narratives can be shaped by the political needs of those who control the historical record. The truth about Elizabeth Bathory may never be fully known, but her case highlights the importance of examining our assumptions about evil, particularly when those assumptions align so conveniently with existing prejudices and power structures. What makes these killers particularly chilling is how their methods evolved and adapted to their circumstances. Elizabeth Bathory operated within the rigid hierarchy of 16th century nobility, using her aristocratic privilege as both shield and weapon. Her castle became a fortress of horror where young women disappeared into chambers that historians can only imagine. The sheer scale of her alleged crimes, potentially numbering in the hundreds, suggests a level of systematic brutality that defies comprehension. Yet modern scholarship raises haunting questions about Bathory's guilt. Was she truly the blood countess of legend, bathing in virgin blood to preserve her youth? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by political enemies who coveted her vast estates? The truth may be even more disturbing than the myth. Court records from her trial contain testimonies of horrific torture methods, victims found frozen to death in courtyards, and servants who participated in unspeakable acts. But these same records were compiled by men who stood to gain everything from her downfall. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory bathing in blood didn't appear until over a century after her death, suggesting that myth-making and reality became hopelessly intertwined. What we know for certain is that she was walled up alive in her own castle, left to die in a tiny chamber with only small slots for food and air. She spent her final 4 years in that living tomb, and whether she was a monster or a victim, her end was undeniably cruel. The case reveals something profound about how evil is remembered and transformed. Bathory became a vampire legend, a gothic horror story, but the real horror may have been the corruption of justice itself. In an era where women who accumulated too much power were routinely destroyed, her story serves as both cautionary tale and possible tragedy of injustice. Moving from medieval castles to 1970s San Francisco, the zebra murders represent evil driven by ideology rather than personal pathology. Manuel Moore and his co-conspirators weren't driven by sexual compulsion or psychological breakdown. They were motivated by racial hatred so pure and systematic that it transformed random city streets into hunting grounds. The zebra killers selected their victims based solely on skin color, turning everyday activities like waiting for a bus or walking home from work into potentially fatal encounters. Between 1973 and 1974, they terrorized San Francisco with a campaign of racially motivated violence that claimed multiple lives and wounded many others. The randomness was the point. They wanted to create a climate of fear that would paralyze the white community. Manuel Moore was part of a group that called themselves the Death Angels, believing they could earn their way into paradise by killing white people. The ideology behind these murders was as calculated as it was twisted. They kept scores, competed with each other, and treated murder as a religious duty. This wasn't crime driven by desperation or mental illness. It was evil as ideology, hatred transformed into systematic action. The investigation became one of the largest police operations in San Francisco history. The random nature of the attacks made them nearly impossible to predict or prevent. Witnesses described attackers who seemed calm, almost casual, as they approached their victims. There was no warning, no opportunity to reason or negotiate. The victims were simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time with the wrong skin color. The racial dynamics of the case created additional tensions throughout the city. The African American community found itself caught between horror at the crimes and fear of potential backlash. Police tactics, including controversial stop and search operations, raised questions about civil liberties, even as the city demanded action. The case exposed deep fractures in American society during a period already marked by racial tension and social upheaval. When Manuel Moore and his associates were finally arrested and convicted, it marked the end of one of the most ideologically driven serial killing campaigns in American history. But the questions raised by their crimes lingered. How does hatred become so absolute that murder feels righteous? What social conditions allow such extreme ideologies to take root and flourish? The zebra murders remind us that evil isn't always individual pathology. Sometimes it's collective madness, shared delusion that transforms ordinary people into instruments of terror. Moore died in prison in 2017, but the ideology that motivated him continues to surface in different forms, in different places, proving that some forms of evil are remarkably persistent and adaptable. These 5 killers represent different facets of human evil across centuries and continents. Samuel Mason embodied the chaos of frontier lawlessness, using America's vast wilderness to hide his crimes. Larry Ayler represented the mobility of modern evil, using highways and anonymous encounters to fuel his deadly compulsions. The freeway phantom remains a mystery, but his crimes expose the systemic failures that allow certain victims to be forgotten and certain cases to go unsolved. Manuel Moore and the Zebra Killers showed how ideology can transform hatred into systematic violence, while Elizabeth Bathory's story reveals how power, legend, and historical narrative can become so intertwined that truth itself becomes elusive. Each case illuminates different aspects of evil, from personal pathology to social breakdown, from individual madness to collective hatred. What connects these disparate killers across time and geography is their ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of their respective societies. Mason preyed on the isolation of frontier life. Ayler used the anonymity of modern transportation. The freeway phantom targeted a marginalized community whose disappearances weren't prioritized. The zebra killers exploited racial tensions and urban anonymity. Bathory, if guilty, used aristocratic privilege to shield her crimes. Their stories serve as dark mirrors reflecting the societies that produced them. They remind us that evil isn't some external force that invades our communities from outside. These cases represent more than just individual acts of violence. They reveal the complex intersection of personal pathology, societal failures, and the darkest corners of human nature. Samuel Mason transformed from Revolutionary War hero to frontier predator, leaving his bloody signature across America's untamed wilderness. His descent from respected militia captain to the notorious Mason of the Woods demonstrates how even those who once served their country can become its greatest threats. Larry Ayler systematically hunted vulnerable young men across the Midwest highways, turning America's roads into hunting grounds. His methodical approach to murder, combined with his ability to blend into society, made him particularly dangerous. The highway killer's reign of terror lasted years because he understood how to exploit the invisibility of marginalized victims. His case highlights how serial killers often target those society overlooks, knowing their disappearances won't generate immediate attention or resources. His most haunting unsolved cases. 6 young African American girls became victims of a predator who understood the power dynamics of 1970s America. The killer's psychological manipulation of victims, forcing Brenda Woodward to write her own death note, reveals a level of cruelty that extends beyond physical violence into psychological torture. The case remains officially unsolved, though investigators have identified persons of interest over the decades. Manuel Moore in the Zebra Murders represents something even more chilling than individual psychopathy. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated acts of racial terrorism. Moore and his associates targeted white victims not out of personal vendetta, but as part of an ideological campaign of hate. Their crimes demonstrate how extremist beliefs can transform ordinary individuals into instruments of systematic terror. The Zebra Murders terrorized San Francisco and highlighted the dangerous intersection of racial hatred and organized violence. Elizabeth Bathory's story has become legend, but separating fact from fiction reveals something equally disturbing. Whether she actually bathed in blood or was the victim of political conspiracy, her case shows how power, isolation, and unchecked authority can create conditions for horrific abuse. The Blood Countess represents the dangers of absolute power in feudal society, where the wealthy could literally get away with murder for decades. Modern scholarship suggests she may have been framed by those who coveted her vast wealth, making her story as much about political manipulation as criminal behavior. What unites these killers across centuries and continents is their ability to exploit the vulnerabilities in their societies. Mason preyed on frontier lawlessness. Eiler used America's highway system and society's indifference to missing young men. The freeway phantom exploited racial prejudices that made police investigations less thorough. Moore weaponized ideology to justify murder. Bathory may have been destroyed by the very power structures she represented. These cases also reveal how justice itself can be corrupted or delayed. Mason was betrayed by his own criminal associates. Eiler died of AIDS before facing full accountability. The freeway phantom was never caught. Moore died in prison decades after his crimes. Bathory may have been the victim rather than the perpetrator. Justice, when it came at all, often came too late for the victims and their families. The most disturbing aspect of these cases isn't the violence itself, but how easily these killers moved through society undetected. They held jobs, maintained relationships, and appeared normal to those around them. This ordinariness makes them more frightening than any fictional monster because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. These forgotten killers remind us that human monsters aren't relics of the past. They walk among us in every generation, in every society, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, vulnerability, and circumstance. Understanding their methods, motivations, and the conditions that enabled their crimes isn't about sensationalizing violence, but about recognizing the patterns that allow such predators to flourish. The victims of these killers weren't just statistics. They were children, young adults, and vulnerable people whose lives were cut short by encounters with evil. Carol Spinks was 13 when the freeway phantom took her life. John LeMay was 17 when he told a neighbor he was visiting someone named Dave. Each victim had dreams, families, and futures that were stolen by these predators. Remembering their names and their stories is as important as understanding their killers. These cases span centuries and continents, yet they share common threads that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. They show us that evil adapts to every era, exploiting whatever systems of power, transportation, or social organization exist. From feudal castles to frontier settlements to modern highways, predators find ways to hunt. The methods change, But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Those with power prey upon those without it. Perhaps most chilling of all is how these killers have been largely forgotten by history while more famous criminals become household names. Their obscurity doesn't diminish their impact on the families destroyed or the communities terrorized. It simply means their lessons remain unlearned, their patterns unrecognized, and their methods available for the next generation of predators to discover and refine. The study of these forgotten killers serves as a reminder that vigilance against evil isn't a luxury but a necessity. Evil doesn't retire, it doesn't reform, and it doesn't announce its presence. It simply waits, adapts, and strikes when society lets its guard down. These cases teach us that the price of safety is constant awareness of the darkness that exists within human nature and the systems we create to contain it.